Welcome to Cutting Through the Noise. I'm your host, David Siegel. Each week I game the system to bring you new ideas for a brighter future. Today my guest is Ron Pol. He's an expert on regulatory effectiveness. We're talking about anti-money laundering regulations. Do they work? I'd like to welcome Ron Pol to the show. You're in New Zealand, is that right, Ron?
I am at the moment, yes.
Where are you?
In Wellington at the moment, David.
Now you're an expert in anti-money laundering. Give us a quick overview of AML and why it is failing.
Well, it's something that started back in the late 1980s. The G7 decided that they wanted to combat the problem of drugs trafficking back then. So they set up a thing called the Financial Action Task Force in 1990. And that was tasked with combating money laundering. Well, essentially what they did, they set up 40 recommendations and they suggested that countries should adopt those 40 recommendations around the world. And there were only a few countries initially that joined up. There were only a few dozen to begin with. Now there are 205 countries part of the regime. That's more countries than there are countries. And the reason for that, it's countries and jurisdictions. So.
And what did it do? What did it require?
Well, it essentially required countries to set up a compliance regime, and each country had to put in place laws that required its banks and then various other agencies and various other regulatory agencies set up, plus other businesses also had to undertake a risk assessment. They had to implement a whole lot of checking of financial transactions for a whole series of things. And every country was assessed against those 40 standards, and each of the regulators in each of those countries was checking the compliance of all of those banks and other firms.
So the idea, if I understand right, was to watch the money and look for suspicious behavior.
Yes, that's right. And the theory makes a lot of sense. So if you can identify suspicious money transactions that are indicators of criminal activity, then you can identify that criminal activity. You can potentially stop that criminal activity. You can arrest the criminals. You can take their assets and the assets they've purchased with criminal funds, and hopefully therefore stop serious crime.
This is a regime where all the money is watched. And so there's really no what we call permissionless finance. There's no, you have to be identified, right? So break down the steps for us quickly.
Well, that's right. Essentially, there's billions of transactions, financial transactions are indeed watched. There's a form of scrutiny that takes place. It's by the banks, but it's also by real estate agents in many countries, not every country, by lawyers, by accountants, by casinos as well, but lots of other financial institutions and service industries. So you mentioned identity. That's something that, when you go to your lawyer, for example, you're going to purchase some real estate, so you might have a real estate agent. They'll each be asking you to prove your identity, to prove that you live where you say you do, etc. Mm-hmm. And that proves compliance. It doesn't necessarily achieve outcomes, but it proves compliance.
Right. And you sign up for a new bank account somehow, then they're going to ask you the standard KYC, know your customer question.
That's exactly right.
And that's all part of it.
Yes. Yeah. And what banks have done over the years, even if you've been with a bank 20 or 30 years, when a new country implements it, and a new business implements it, your bank or your whichever service provider you're using will ask you those questions, even if you've been with them for a long time, even if they know exactly who you are.
So now let's get to, does it work? Did it ever work? Did it snowball into not working, or how do you see the effectiveness?
No, it's been consistent. It hasn't worked from the outset.
It's a complete failure from the first day.
It's difficult to judge. Well, there's a number of things. One, what are we supposed to be doing? The industry says we're supposed to stop money laundering. But my focus, you introduced me as a money laundering expert. My focus is actually policy effectiveness and outcomes, and that's what I look at. So I look at outcomes, and that's a subset of public policy or political science. And that's beyond processes, beyond activities, beyond outputs. What actually works. In essence, if we're looking at crime, we want to try and stop crime. We want to try and stop those harms, the serious harms from drugs trafficking, from arms trafficking, from human trafficking, from sex trafficking, from wildlife trafficking, from all that sort of stuff, fraud, tax evasion. And so when you want to try, so the ultimate harm measure, so the ultimate measure of an outcome is a reduction of harm from serious crime. Very difficult to measure that, so you step back a bit. Okay, you look then perhaps at the reduction of crime. That's also very difficult to measure. But we have one measure that is not a perfect outcome measure, but it's an indicator towards it, and that's how much criminal proceeds are interdicted by these rules. And the United Nations calls this the success rate of anti-money laundering regulations. And if you look at that, pretty much we get roughly $3 billion a year of criminal assets globally, and some estimates say that there are $3 trillion generated each year. So that's 0.1%. So on that basis, and these figures are fairly dodgy.
Just to be clear, they seize and interdict, take control over $3 billion that are supposedly money laundered, but there's $3 trillion worth of illegal activity.
So if we're at, say, 0.1% of effectiveness after 30 years of these controls that cost around $300 billion per year in compliance costs, which is 100 times more than the amount that is actually interdicted, just interesting itself, then crims get to keep up to 99.9% of criminal proceeds. So if those figures pan out, then what we're looking at is something that it's not only not as a tax, it's hardly a rounding error on criminal accounts.
Right. And so one thing you're saying is that criminals don't really care. In fact, maybe they like it. Is that possible?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. There are two global industries that benefit enormously from these rules, and that's organized crime and organized compliance.
Let me focus in on this $300 billion that is spent. What is that all about? How many countries are spending all this money, and what are they doing? That's a lot.
Well, that's another estimate. That the $300 billion comes from another series of estimates that have been undertaken by a number of firms that have been stitched together. But that actually is only the corporate cost. That's the private sector cost. So that's the banks, the law firms, etc., that have to pay compliance costs. They have to pay for software. They have to pay for huge compliance departments when there's a breach of anti-money laundering rules, and a big bank will hire another 1,000 compliance professionals, etc. And so that excludes the government sector. So the government sector's on top of that. There are something like 86, 87 supranational government agencies, so international government agencies that have connections in this area as well. So that's the IMF, the World Bank, all the various regional development banks, plus a whole bunch of FATF-like organizations. Plus, in each individual country, there are lots of government agencies. There's at least one or two in every country, and there's often several dozen. So in the UK, for example, there are several dozen agencies with AML controls. So their costs actually go on top of that $300 billion. But no one's estimated what that is.
Now we're catching $3 billion in bad money, and I can believe that sex trafficking and wild animal endangered species and all that is definitely bad news for society. But every so often we read that banks are fined many billions of dollars for violating these laws. So it sounds like the banks are pretty solidly in the money laundering business, and the fines are just part of that business model.
It's interesting, when you actually look at a lot of those breaches, a great many of those breaches, not all of them, but a great many of those breaches are for breaches of anti-money laundering laws and regulations. They're not actually for any laundering that's taken place, nor for any crime that's taken place. They just didn't have. They just didn't happen to have. So, for example, in most countries,
not following procedure correctly.
That's exactly right. Now, that's not all the case. So, for example, HSBC was penalised heavily, the $1.9 billion fine for, actually facilitating Mexican laundering. So there are many exceptions where there are genuine crimes taking place and there are genuine laundering taking place that are facilitated by the banks. But when you look at it, a great many of them are not. They are, you didn't tick the box correctly, we are going to penalise you.
But in the case of banks actually laundering money for clients, would that be in the tens of billions, hundreds of billions?
Oh, certainly large amounts, because most laundering that takes place does actually take place through the banks. But it's also what you need to think about. The banks are not necessarily at fault, and so sometimes if laundering takes place through a bank, then there's a continuum of activity. So the bank may have been innocently duped, completely duped by the crims. The bank may have been unwittingly used by the criminals. So there were perhaps a few red flags that they just didn't spot, and it's possibly fair enough they didn't spot it. Then it gets to the next level where they were willfully blind. There were lots of red flags and they chose not to ask questions. Now that's when they really, really do need to be pinged for that activity, and that does actually happen. And then there's those fewer occasions when they were complicit, when the bank actually, or the lawyer or the accountant or the real estate agent, whatever business it is, actually knowingly facilitated the laundering criminal proceeds through their business.
I guess if I were a large criminal organization, I would just buy a bank.
That's been done a few times.
That
has been done. Yes, that has been done. There was, in fact, a book many years ago that somebody put out about how to, how to set up your own bank for these purposes.
Yeah, right.
But absolutely right. That's a very, very efficient way of laundering large sums of criminal proceeds to purchase a bank. That has been done in the past. People have tried to do it a number of times. But there are lots of other ways of doing it too. In fact, in my own research, I looked at lawyers, accountants, and real estate agents in real estate transactions. And the most efficient way to launder criminal proceeds in that way, I found empirically over a 20-year period, was to have accountants who knew that what they were doing, they were complicit in it, and therefore they would hire the lawyers. They would be the interface between the real estate agents, the lawyers, etc., and they provided a degree of respectability, and there were red flags, but the lawyers thought, oh well, those accountants, we know them, they're down the road, etc.
Right.
But as you say, the top flight way of doing it is to buy a bank.
Sure. I mean, it's not that. Okay. Now I kind of want to end up now with why are we really doing this? Is this the right way to solve the problem? And the only way to know that is, what is the problem? Now I would like to do whatever it takes to stop 100% of human trafficking and slavery. Okay. I don't care. Okay. That's important to me. I think that things like endangered species importation, okay, that should be tight, all right? Yes. But then when you get to things like terrorism and drug money and whatever else is illegal, I always want to know, well, how do we, it's not illegal in California, it is illegal in Indiana, it's not, in a lot of cases, the CIA does a lot of the same stuff, and 20 years later, the product of that becomes a cartel that, you later have to deal with. So how do you know who the bad guys really are and what problem really to solve?
Well, that's a very, very good question. That's a significant debate. At the moment, they say that they're trying to protect the integrity of the financial system. That is almost completely meaningless. It means it just is meaningless, and it's also predicated on the assumption that money laundering causes harm. That's not necessarily the case either.
Right.
It's not money laundering that causes the harm, it's the crime that causes the harm. Then there's the other issue where you mentioned terrorism. There's a whole range of issues there, because Nelson Mandela was mandated terrorist. Today we wouldn't think he was a terrorist, but he was then. So it depends to a certain extent on your definition of terrorist. But even putting that to one side, even if we have, we all agree on a terrorist activity, etc., this is a different beast. We want to stop that activity before it happens, which is a completely different system than we have for spotting a financial transaction after a crime's taken place, and then we can go and take their criminal assets afterwards. It's a completely different beast. I described this particular system that we have for the anti-money laundering system is we've put out a colander to try and catch water. It's not worked, so we've added another colander on top of it, and then another one on top of that. We now have a huge pile of colanders to try and catch water.
Right. Now, you told me previously, and I thought this was amazing, they realized it doesn't work, finally. What are they doing to try to fix it?
After 20 odd years, they introduced a new framework that is it is expressed as an effectiveness methodology based on outcomes. Now, in terms of my expertise, that is exactly what it is. My expertise, my PhD is in policy effectiveness and outcomes, and so I've assessed that. I've done the first global assessment of that a year or so back. It was published in one of the journals. And unfortunately, I found that the effectiveness framework is not an effectiveness framework. It is completely incapable of assessing effectiveness as it purports. Right. It uses the language of effectiveness. It uses the language of outcomes, but it doesn't introduce any of the science.
It's just, again, measuring whether you're ticking the boxes or not.
Yeah, and it adds another 11 boxes to the 40 we already had. It didn't get rid of those 40. We still have to do those.
Right.
So there are now 51 boxes. Each of them has 4 alternate ticks. And fascinating too, because I found also that when you do the analysis, you find that those 11 track back perfectly to those 40. And those 40 track to those 11, and they use the same evidence, largely the same evidence in the same groupings to do it. So in a sense, it's a little harsh to say it, but in a sense, the 11 outcome measures are an abbreviated index of the 40.
My last question is, let's talk another time about whether we're doing the right thing here, because I'm not convinced we are at all. But if we wanted those outcomes, and if the laws this regime isn't achieving them, what would you do to get those outcomes?
First of all, we need to, one, recognize that the system isn't working. Now, that isn't the case. There is no impetus on the agencies involved to actually ask that question. The reason there's a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the key reasons that there's no impetus to ask is because they've been so successful at getting these rules around the world. The reason they're so successful at getting these rules around the world is not because they work, it's because very smartly, although counterproductively, I think, they connected it with access to the financial system. You, country X, must put these rules in place, otherwise you can't have access to the financial system. Right? So therefore, countries implement the rules. But what I believe, and it's not finalised yet, but I believe there's around 6 or 7 steps that need to be undertaken to turn this around. And what it's looking like at the moment, I can't give you detail, unfortunately, because it's not quite finalised, but what it's looking like at the moment is that it'll be vastly cheaper and vastly more effective. Because there's not really that much point in putting colanders out to catch water. We'll put something that is more likely to catch a little bit more water, something with a solid base, for example. Now, that doesn't mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to mix my my metaphor somewhat, because there are a lot of things about the system that work well. So the simple fact that there is this global network in place, that is actually potentially quite positive. And there's no reason to get rid of that and do something completely different. But the very first thing we need to do, and countries haven't done that, and the international system hasn't done it, is actually recognise that there's a problem. And secondly, to identify what it is we're trying to achieve. Are we trying to stop money laundering, or are we trying to stop crime? That's a critical distinction.
My hypothesis is banks actually love AML because it prevents innovators from coming into the market. Does it prevent innovation?
Banks both hate it and love it in a funny sort of way, I think. Banks hate it because it costs billions of dollars in compliance costs that drives all that cost into their system. So there's a piece of research out which suggests, and The Economist recently, I think, the city has got nearly 15% of its staff as compliance people. Other banks have got nearly 10%.
Maybe it's great because it keeps them. It's so hard for small companies to move up and compete with them.
Now that's the point. That's exactly right. There's a massive barrier to entry to others because they've got to put in place these enormous systems. It is almost completely ineffective. but you've got to have that in place. So it's a massive barrier to entry as well.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate this update on AML. I hope that people will come and learn about effective outcomes. What's the name of your website?
AMLassurance.com.
Great. And you're on LinkedIn, and you're publishing quite widely, and actually you're listed on our website, Cutting Through the Noise.
Thank you.
If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Come to our website for a daily dose of reality. Become a member of our online community and join us here each week for another insightful interview from Cutting Through the Noise.